At the upcoming BRICS Summit in Kazan, a primary focus will be the reform of international financial institutions, particularly the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has underscored the need to address these issues to enhance global economic governance, making it more inclusive and representative of emerging economies. The BRICS nations advocate for reforms that align with the economic realities of the 21st century. They argue that the current structures of the IMF and WTO disproportionately favor developed countries and inadequately represent the interests of the Global South. This includes calls to revise the IMF's quota system to give more weight to developing nations and to restore the full functionality of the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism. In this video, we'll explore the reasons behind the dissatisfaction with the IMF and WTO by examining cases where their policies have caused significant issues for borrowing countries. We'll also discuss the solutions proposed by the Global South to address these challenges. Let's get started. Which BRICS or Global South countries have suffered due to IMF loans and imposed policies? Egypt. In exchange for a loan, Egypt had to remove subsidies on basic food items, leading to significant price increases. This sparked mass protests and riots in Cairo, known as the bread riots, where the military was deployed to quell the unrest. The government eventually reinstated the subsidies to calm the situation. Brazil received an IMF loan to support its currency during a financial crisis, with conditions that included fiscal austerity and structural reforms. The program faced significant opposition within Brazil and was criticized for its impact on public services and economic growth. However, some argue that it helped stabilize the Brazilian economy in the long term. Morocco. Similar to Egypt, Morocco's agreement with the IMF required the removal of food subsidies, leading to sharp price hikes. This resulted in the Casablanca riots, where police and military forces killed hundreds of protesters. Despite the severe crackdown, the riots led to significant social unrest and long-term political consequences. Nigeria. The IMF imposed a structural adjustment program that included removing subsidies and devaluing the currency. This led to widespread protests and strikes, culminating in the violent uprisings of 1989. The program's harsh economic measures severely impacted Nigeria's economy and social stability. Venezuela. Known as the Caracazo, IMF-imposed austerity measures led to riots and social upheaval. The removal of fuel subsidies triggered widespread protests and violence, resulting in many deaths. This period of turmoil eventually contributed to the political rise of Hugo Chavez. Indonesia. During the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia agreed to an IMF program that required austerity measures, including subsidy cuts and financial sector reforms. The ensuing economic hardship led to widespread riots and the eventual fall of President Suharto's long-standing regime. Pakistan has had multiple IMF programs since 1988, with conditions often including fiscal austerity, structural reforms, and subsidy cuts. These measures have frequently led to economic hardship for the population, causing protests and political instability. The most recent agreements continue to be controversial due to their stringent conditions and the ongoing economic difficulties they impose. Kenya. In the 1990s, Kenya entered into an IMF structural adjustment program that included privatization of state-owned enterprises and cuts in public spending. These measures led to economic stagnation, increased poverty, and widespread social unrest. Critics argue that the program failed to address the structural issues in Kenya's economy and instead worsened the socio-economic conditions. Why countries, including those in BRICS, are unhappy with the IMF? Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel for more videos about BRICS development, power, and influence on the world. Let's continue now. The Global South has several major issues with the IMF, which primarily revolve around the conditions attached to IMF loans and the broader impact of its policies. Let's list the problems one by one. Structural adjustment programs. One of the most significant criticisms is related to SAPs, which were heavily implemented in the 1980s and 1990s. These programs required countries to adopt specific economic policies, such as austerity measures, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and trade liberalization as conditions for receiving IMF loans. Critics argue that these policies often led to increased poverty and social inequality as they prioritized debt repayment and fiscal stability over social welfare and economic development. Undermining sovereignty. The economic policy conditions imposed by the IMF are seen as undermining the sovereignty of borrower nations. By mandating specific policies and reforms, the IMF limits the ability of these countries to design and implement their own development strategies. This has led to accusations that the IMF's interventions prioritize the interests of wealthy creditor nations over those of the borrowing countries. Bias and decision-making. There is also criticism regarding the biased and inconsistent decision-making within the IMF, which tends to favor the political and economic interests of its major shareholders, primarily developed countries. This bias can influence the choice of interventions and the conditions attached to financial assistance, often resulting in decisions that do not align with the needs of the Global South. Debt burden. Many countries in the Global South argue that the IMF's approach to debt restructuring is inadequate. The current frameworks often fail to provide meaningful debt relief and do not address the underlying issues that lead to debt crises. The lack of a multilateral legal framework for debt negotiations, where debtor countries can collectively advocate for fairer terms, exacerbates this problem. Impact on social services. The IMF's emphasis on fiscal consolidation often results in cuts to essential public services such as healthcare and education. This focus on reducing public expenditure can hinder long-term development and exacerbate social inequalities as it limits the ability of governments to invest in crucial infrastructure and social programs. Concerns about WTO. The Global South faces several major issues with the WTO, primarily related to the inequities in trade rules and negotiations, as well as the institutional challenges within the organization. Let's list the major problems of the WTO one by one. Imbalance in trade rules. The WTO's trade rules often disproportionately benefit developed countries. For instance, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS, imposes stringent intellectual property protections that can hinder access to essential medicines and technologies for developing countries. The agricultural policies promoted by the WTO also tend to favor developed nations with large agribusinesses, leading to local farmers in the Global South being unable to compete with subsidized imports from richer countries. Negotiation power. Disparity. Developing countries often lack the human and technical resources needed to effectively negotiate within the WTO. This puts them at a disadvantage compared to developed nations that have more extensive teams of negotiators and technical experts. As a result, the outcomes of trade negotiations frequently reflect the priorities and interests of wealthier countries. Institutional issues and plurilateral agreements. The move towards plurilateral agreements, where only a subset of WTO members negotiate and agree on specific trade rules, has been a contentious issue. While these agreements can make negotiations more manageable, they can also marginalize countries that are not part of the negotiations, often those from the Global South. Countries like India and South Africa have argued that such approaches undermine the multilateral principles of the WTO and can lead to rules that do not consider the needs of all member countries. Transparency and notification. There are chronic issues with transparency and compliance with notification requirements within the WTO. Many countries, including some from the Global South, fail to notify their trading partners about subsidies and other critical information. This lack of compliance erodes trust and makes it difficult to negotiate new agreements or enforce existing ones effectively. Dispute settlement mechanism. The WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, particularly the appellate body, has faced significant challenges, including blockages in appointing new judges, which have stalled its function. This has been a point of contention as the mechanism is crucial for resolving trade disputes fairly, and its dysfunction disproportionately affects smaller and developing countries that rely on it to challenge unfair trade practices by more powerful nations. Suggestions or solutions proposed by Global South. The Global South has proposed several solutions and suggestions to address the issues they face with the IMF. Reforming conditionalities. One of the primary suggestions is to reform the conditions attached to IMF loans. Many developing countries argue that the stringent austerity measures and economic policy conditions often lead to increased poverty and social inequality. They propose more flexible and context-specific conditions that consider the socio-economic realities of borrower nations, emphasizing growth and development rather than strict fiscal consolidation. Enhancing representation and governance. Developing countries have called for a more equitable representation in the IMF's decision-making processes. Currently, voting power in the IMF is heavily weighted in favor of wealthy countries. The Global South advocates for a reallocation of quotas and voting shares to better reflect the current global economic landscape and give developing countries a stronger voice. Establishing a multilateral legal framework for debt. The Global South has proposed creating a multilateral legal framework within the United Nations for debt negotiations. This framework would provide a more transparent and fair platform for restructuring debt, allowing debtor countries to negotiate collectively rather than individually. This approach aims to address power imbalances and ensure more favorable terms for debt relief, promoting sustainable development goals. There is a call for the IMF to align its policies and programs with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This would involve integrating social and environmental considerations into economic policies and providing financial support for projects that promote sustainable development and poverty reduction. Encouraging local ownership of programs. Developing countries suggest that the IMF should promote greater local ownership of economic programs and reforms. This means involving local governments and communities in the design and implementation of IMF-supported programs to ensure that they are tailored to the specific needs and priorities of the country. Increasing transparency and accountability. Improving the transparency and accountability of the IMF's operations is another key suggestion. This includes clearer communication of the rationale behind policy recommendations and loan conditions, as well as regular assessments of the impact of IMF programs on borrowing countries. Support for capacity building. To address the technical and administrative challenges faced by many developing countries, there is a need for the IMF to provide more support for capacity building. This includes training and technical assistance to help countries improve their economic management and policy-making capabilities. Do you agree with the proposed reforms for the IMF and WTO? How do you think these changes could impact the global economy? Which BRICS or Global South country do you think has been most affected by IMF policies? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to get exclusive videos about how phenomenally BRICS is developing and growing its influence over the world. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.